All right, then we are live now. Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone present in today's session. I, Pragnya Panda, welcome you to the Stories of Beliefs and Social Customs, curated under TMYS Review June 2022 in collaboration with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. We are also calling for the submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Professor Xenia Zeiler and Professor Debashis Bandyopadhyay, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic of today's discussion is violence in festivals under the sub-theme Festivities and Ritualistic Practices. Both of them are experts in this area with many years of professional experience. So before we start today's discussion, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our distinguished speakers. Our first speaker for tonight is Professor Xenia Zeiler, who is a professor of South Asian Studies at the University of Helsinki. Her research and teaching are situated at the intersection of digital media, culture, and society, specifically as related to India and the global Indian community. Her research foci are video games and gaming in India, digital religion, especially Hinduism, global Hinduism, and Tantric traditions. She also researches and teaches aspects of global digital humanities and popular culture, especially as related to India. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for the invitation.
Our second speaker for tonight is Professor Debashis Bandyopadhyay, who is a professor of English at Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Guanajuato, Mexico. Formerly, he taught at Vidyasagar University, West Bengal, and Banaras Hindu University. As a Fulbright Fellow, he taught and pursued research at California State University, Fresno, California, USA. And as a Charles Wallace Fellow, he pursued research at Oxford University, UK. His research interests include indigenous culture, psychoanalytic hermeneutics, and Buddhist American performance poetry. He is widely published in India and abroad. His book, Locating the Anglo-Indian Self in Ruskin Bond, a post-colonial review brought out by the Anthem Press, New York, is the first scholarly intervention into the life and works of the Anglo-Indian author. We welcome you, sir. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Pragya. Thank you.
I would now so we are now open. Now we open the forum for discussion. I would like to invite Professor Zeiler to share her views on this topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, and thank you again for having us here. I would actually like to show some slides to illustrate what I'm going to input, because this is what I was asked to. I was asked to give a short introductory view and thoughts on the topic, and I would like to point out a few facts. The most important thing which I might want to stress right in the beginning is that we should be aware, we should keep in the back of our heads that, of course, negotiations about festivals and festival practices, they happen in many spaces. And one of them certainly are digital spaces. In fact, they become increasingly important. This is one of the things I'm working at, and of course, many colleagues around the world work on this. So I want to show you 2-3 examples of how such festivals themselves, how they happen and how they are celebrated and how they occur in online spaces and as related to online spaces. And one of the virtual spaces I'm going to highlight here are, in fact, video games, which is another of my research foci. So I think it's very important to understand that video games by today are one of the most influential media genres of all. And they are very important because persons of any age, of any gender, of any social background, all around the world, they either play games themselves, or even if they don't play games by themselves, they are still impacted or influenced by them on many levels, because either they speak to persons who play, they have kids who play, they have friends who play. So this information which is in fact conveyed in video games and in discussions or debates around certain video games, that in fact reaches many more people than just the people who play games themselves. So it's quite clear that game narratives and game aesthetics and things like that, they do impact on meaning making in general and on the construction of society and what people believe and practice. And this is the reason why for 20 years or a bit more even now, the study of video games and culture has become a very serious field of research in the humanities and in the social sciences. It is also important to please keep in mind that the study of video game cultures is obviously not restricted to the games themselves, what they convey, what they speak about, what kind of aesthetics they have. But rather, it encompasses the whole context of video games, which I triggered before already. That is, we cannot understand games as digital culture when looking at games alone. Rather, we should take into account what games initiate in society, for instance, which cultural debates they trigger, and so on. One of the important questions which very closely ties to this panel and which colleagues of mine and I have been working on increasingly is to ask how video games contribute to the construction of value systems on both individual and social levels. Let me give you a few examples from India. Let me tell a little bit about games produced in India, and explicitly about, or in particular, about games which make a strong use of what I would call Indian cultural heritage elements. And it's interesting to see that the spectrum of how this is done today is very broad, actually. There are several examples by now of games which have come out, which are on the market and playable, which do, in fact, take up this Indian cultural heritage, including festival culture. Not only festival culture, of course, there are other things, of course. Let me give you 3 short examples. This is the first. It's a game called Asura, which is in its narrative and in the game characters, as the name indicates, quite heavily influenced by Hindu mythological culture. But what is very interesting is that it's not only the mythological content which is transported into the game, but rather it goes much beyond the aesthetics. The aesthetics in this game would be, for instance, choosing certain dress style, choosing certain colors which connect to color symbolism, the name, as I said, of some of the characters, including the main figure Asura, they stem from Hindu mythology. But the game goes one level beyond that, beyond this direct implementation of Hindu mythological backgrounds. It is structured in a way which actually refers to the cyclic understanding of some Hindu mythological texts. As we don't have very much time, let me quickly give you a second example. This is a game which has come out 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago in 2020. And it was very well received international. The game is called Raji, an ancient epic. The video game is a quote from the original website, from the game developers themselves, is a video game set in ancient India. And it quite intensively draws on Hindu mythology, and in its narratives, we do have again these artistic elements in the visual art. We do have sound here also heavily employed. We hear classical Indian music which accompanies the game, and so on. All of this is part of this quite successful game, Raji. And then I would like to show you in the end of what my initial thoughts are, two very brief examples of also something which I think is of interest to this panel in detail. There are out there so-called educational or serious video games. That is, video games which are developed particularly to convey information or knowledge about certain topics. And of course, these educational video games can be, they can contribute to what a person believes and practices. I was in the happy situation that my university, the University of Helsinki, sponsored the development of two educational video games, both centered on the festival of Durga Puja. And these games are developed specifically to target non-Indian learners, university students, and possibly high school students. These are open access games. They are free to play. Everyone can check them out. They convey information about the festival, Durga Puja, its history, its traditions, its cultural practices, and all that is packed in a video game, which can be hopefully, which can be used to trigger the learning process in a different way than traditional learning tools would do. I did not, you might have noticed that is the second video game, by the way. I did not speak a lot about violence in my initial thought, which is, of course, another title of this panel. It's one of the themes of this panel. And I did so because violence, of course, is a broad term, and I would really appreciate us all defining violence before we go on speaking about this and how it relates to festival cultures. Thank you. That was my input.
Thank you, ma'am. That was indeed fascinating. I would now like to take the opportunity to introduce Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, who has just joined us. Welcome, sir. Professor Mark Juergensmeyer is a distinguished professor emeritus of sociology and global studies and interim director of the Orphelia Center for Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and William F. Podlick Distinguished Fellow and Professor of Religious Studies at Claremont McKenna College. He is a pioneer in global studies, focusing on global religion, religious violence, conflict resolution, and South Asian religion and politics. He has published more than 300 articles and 30 books, including the recent God at War, Oxford 2020, the award winning Terror in the Mind of God, University of California Press, 4th edition, 2017, and his co edited Oxford Handbook of Global Studies, Oxford 2018. We welcome you, sir. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be a part of the discussion. My focus, as you very graciously acknowledge, is on the rise of religion and violence around the world, particularly the rise of violence related to religious nationalism. This is a comparative study, but it didn't start as a comparative study because, as the speaker mentioned, my initial work was in South Asia, in India. I lived for a while in the Punjab. I taught at Punjab University. And so when the rise of Sikh nationalism, or a form of Sikh activism, developed in the 1980s, that was in a sense related to Sanjanal Singh Bhindranwale, although it was a very complicated movement. There were a lot of different factions and a lot of different groups in it. But I wanted to know why, because after all, these could have been my former students who were involved in this movement. So the interest was not just intellectual, but also quite personal. And what I found was that there was a resurgence of a need for social identity that was related in many cases to religion and religious identity, but that focused itself in a political way. in a form of cultural nationalism. And so I took that insight on the road. And so since then, I've looked around the world, particularly in the Middle East, but now increasingly in Europe and the United States. And what we're seeing in Ukraine, for example, today is in some ways a kind of cultural or religious nationalism. There's no question that Putin has all kinds of political ambitions related to his own megalomania and his own kind of desire for power, but there's also a sense of Russian aggrandizement in a cultural sense. And you can see this because of the role of the Patriarch Kirill, who is firmly behind this movement in the Ukraine, to the astonishment of a lot of religious scholars and religious leaders who had previously dealt with him in more amiable kinds of circumstances. But the religiosity of people within the Ukraine is to a large extent similar. They're Orthodox, but also in many ways proudly different. They have their own patriarch, they have their own identity. And for many, this is a clash of cultures and not just a clash of politics. So that brings us back to the larger question of what religion has to do with any of this. And is religion inherently violent, as some observers say? Well, my own personal analysis is that religion doesn't do anything by itself, like any other aspect of culture. It's simply an extension of the human imagination and an extension of human activism and human need. And when humans are seeking after power and change and social identity, often religion becomes a part of the mix. You know, when you talk about the word religion, it can mean many different things. I remember when I was first in the Punjab trying to understand the religion of village Punjabis, I was told there was no simple word in any Indian language for religion. In the Punjab, you could speak of Qaum, which means a great community. You could speak of Pant, that means a fellowship. You could speak of Mazhab, which means belief. You could speak of Dharam, which means religious law. What is it that you mean when you talk about religion? And so increasingly, the instances of religious violence and religious nationalism that we see around the world, and the violence is often associated with this nationalism, is a matter of religious identity and a matter of social identity rather than a belief or theology. And one example of this is ISIS, a movement that I've studied extensively on many trips to primarily to northern Iraq, visiting refugees and now people in prison related to the ISIS movement, including some of the more hardcore leaders of the movement. Yes, and among the inner core, there is a subscription to a kind of apocalyptic Muslim millenarian end of the world scenario, which is very unusual within Islam. It's a very odd movement within Islam. Many Muslims don't regard it as Muslim at all. So the theology of it, that held tightly by members of the inner circle, is kind of bizarre and extreme. And exclusive to the members of the inner circle, the vast number of people who support the movement and who have supported it in eastern Syria and western Iraq do so for reasons of social identity, because it gives Sunni Muslim Arabs an identity and a power in two countries that are dominated by Shia in the case of Iraq and a kind of Shiism, the Alawites in the case of Syria, but make the Sunni Arabs feel like they're second-class citizens. So ISIS for them was not so much a theological movement as it was a movement that would empower the people of their religious identity, their social group. It's a social movement, in that sense, not a religious movement, although religion was related to it. Just as within Ireland, the Catholics and Protestants were at each other's throats, not for theological reasons, but because of social identity. And to a large extent, this is true also in Palestine, in the the conflict between Palestinian Muslims and Christians and Israeli Jews, and many of whom, of course, are Jewish in name, but are primarily are atheists. But that doesn't make any difference. The people are fighting for their people, their identity. So how do festivals and games and these sorts of things get into the mix? Well, they get into the mix because people get into the mix, and they extend their concerns and their interest in all kinds of ways, including those that we associate with playfulness. And in a sense, though, all religion is related to play. It's a form of human imagination that takes place in activity as well as in thought. And you know that in the Indian tradition, where playing with Krishna, the Raslisa, the Ramlila is a very important part of the tradition, and that can become politicized. It can become politicized in a relatively benign way, but it can be politicized in a way that excludes others. And the same is true in other parts of the world. I think of in Ireland, for example, where the Protestants want to assert their authority, so they would choose a parade every year that honored the Orange Men, the tradition of Protestantism of which they were a part. And they would insist on parading through Catholic areas of the town simply to show their dominance, to show their support. This would invariably create violence and tension, because this was not just a parade. This was a show of power. This is a show of strength, that the Protestants could dominate the Catholics. And by that, of course, we mean not theologically, but in terms of social imagination. So religion is a powerful part of the human condition. It's a powerful aspect of social intervention and interaction. So there's no question that it is a part of activities that are often violent, that are persecuting, that are oppressive, not because religion itself is by nature anything other than an extension of the human imagination. And in that sense, it does what humans do in their most evil and in their most benign, and for good as well as for evil.
Thank you, sir. That was indeed thought-provoking. Thank you for sharing your insights. I would like Professor Debashis Bandyopadhyay to speak now. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Pragya. Thank you, Zeiler and Professor Mark. Professor Mark was speaking about the notion of social identity, religious identity as a major marker for understanding the kind of rift or conflict, or for that matter, the kind of bonhomie that works between different communities, which also gets reflected in, especially during the times of festivals and the kind of rituals that are engendered by the festivals. But I would perhaps add a new dimension. I would like to add a new dimension to the notion of violence, which endanger different kinds of festivals, different kinds of religious denominations. From a psychoanalytical point of view, of course, the notion of identity is linked to it, but then my take is to some extent understanding it from what actually happens within the psyche that creates or takes upon itself the notion of religion as a sort of an excuse or a pretext, which the unconscious works upon, creates a sort of an occlusion which human beings consciously doesn't understand how religion as a sort of an excuse or a pretext is working in order to give free play to the notion of aggression that characterizes all human beings. Sigmund Freud, in his famous work called Civilization and Its Discontent, made a very interesting comment saying that when the Bible preached love thy neighbor as thyself, the Bible was very definite. Those who actually marked this particular word were very definitive in their sayings, because they knew very well that loving thy neighbor as yourself is the most difficult and the most impossible thing for human beings to do. That is why they required it to translate into a kind of a law, So much so that when the Bible preaches it, you cannot interrogate that particular law. Otherwise, Freud says that if it was natural for human beings to love other people, then the Bible did not require to have preached it from the altar, uh, and make it very canonical and very religious for that matter. Which Freud has a very important pointer over here. In fact, human beings, for that matter, is basically very aggressive. The two different drives that human beings actually have are pitted against each other, opposed to each other. One is a particular drive to self preserve one's own self, the other is a drive to annihilate one's own self. This particular drive of, or the desire for annihilation, requires to be jettisoned from the self, otherwise it would kill yourself. That is why when we generally mark a person to be mad when he or she tries to commit suicide, it is not very unnatural for a person. That same kind of drive works within us itself. Now, this particular drive that you require to actually jettison from yourself requires to be spent actually. This is a drive which is some full of energy which requires to be spent. You have to preserve yourself by means of the erotic drive, and you have to spend the drive which kills yourself, and you have to put it upon another person. But simultaneously, human beings also suffer from yet another very important instinct, that is the desire for species preservation. So, on the one hand, you have a desire for self preservation, on the other hand, you have a desire for species preservation. But at the same time, you require to jettison this particular aggressive drive from yourself, spend it upon somebody else. Levi Strauss had pointed out, the structuralist anthropologist has pointed out, that throughout human culture, different forms of religion had been validating under the very rubric, under the very sign of religion, the very notion of violation or violence. For example, this particular aggressivity, the thanatic drive within the human beings, they generally spend upon, under the sign of religion, they spend upon different kinds of animals, different kinds of plants. For example, in Hindu religion, we still, even today, during the Kali Puja, in different community pujas, we sacrifice goats, we sacrifice lambs in order to propitiate the gods. In Greek civilization, for that matter, Agamemnon, when he was going to the war against the Trojans, suddenly in cultures, the god comes down and says that unless Agamemnon sacrifices his own daughter, virgin daughter Iphigenia, to the gods, the wind will not move and the Trojan war cannot be fulfilled. So, after a lot of reluctance, Agamemnon yields and finally sacrifices his daughter for the sake of the war. What is this? In the name of religion, in the name of propitiating the god, he does that. In fact, it was an unconscious drive within himself of aggressivity, which he actually spends upon another person. I'm coming to that a while later. I will not take much time. For example, even till the 16th century in Mayan and Aztec civilization, in the name of propitiating the sun god, the Aztecs and the Mayans used to sacrifice the blood of young children upon an altar in order to propitiate the gods. Now, Strauss has been saying that we had been actually inflicting this violence upon animals, which is another species. But the kind of satisfaction that we gain from these particular inflicting of violence upon other species is less than the amount of satisfaction that we gain if we inflict a particular violence upon a person of our own species. That means if I lay hands or violence upon my enemy, quote unquote enemy, which is a human being, the amount of pleasure that I derive from it is perhaps much more than the amount of pleasure that I derive from killing a goat in a particular religious festival. But then we have yet another oppositional drive called desire for species preservation. Then how can I go about laying hands on another person? Herein comes the particular different kinds of differences in terms of caste, in terms of religion, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of jingoistic nationalism, works as a pretext. The unconscious, the ego in the form of an unconscious, comes and tells to your ears. It is not that simple that it comes and tells to your ears, but it is just a metaphor for that matter. telling you that believe Debashis, that this particular group called B is not a human species. It is lesser than a human species, so much so that you can ethically and quite conscientiously spend your violent drive upon that particular group called B, uh, which actually helps us to satisfy both our desire for maximum satisfaction by spending our aggressivity upon a person of my own species, and at the same time uh, serve our desire for species preservation. Because I am serving this particular violence upon a person of group B, which I suspend my disbelief in thinking that he or she does not belong to my species because that is a group B. But at the same time, I gain maximum satisfaction because at the back of my mind, in another part of my split psyche, I understand that that particular person, he very much belongs to the human species. So now, what is this group B? This group A and group B. All people within the group A is my species, and all people within the group B is not my species. In that way, I am expanding my particular notion of the species by getting more people within my particular group, so that the very notion of species preservation is satisfied. And at the same time, I'm creating another kind of a difference called group B in order to satisfy my sense of balance. This particular group B can be another religion. This particular group B can be yet another race. Particular group B can another particular group B can be another nation for that matter. So, the very notion of aggressivity, which is an instinctual libidinal drive within ourselves, generally get complemented by the notions of economic, social, identitarian interests. I'm just simply adding to what Mark had said, that uh, basically we have this particular drive, which acts as where religion acts as a sort of a pretext on an excuse, which if we are not reflective enough, if we do not become cerebral enough to analyze the kind of self-reflexive drives, how it works, we soon fall into the trap of undoing ourselves and at the same time undoing our friends and enemies. This becomes particularly conspicuous, especially in terms of rituals, in terms of festivals, especially during the festivals, those who actually live very lonely lives, especially the kind of research had been done in the USA, which shows that especially during the times of the Christmas and in the times of Christian festivals, the lonely people who live alone generally become very berserk and quite crazy, especially because they understand that people are meeting with each other. They are celebrating a festival where I am simply being left out. I am solitary. This actually shows a kind of desire for species preservation, the gregarious instinct that human beings also have. So the very notion of the fissiparous tendencies and the gregarious instincts work in such a dynamic way that it is very difficult even for a normal man to actually decipher or distinguish between these two particular ideas. So my particular point had been, there had been no time actually to elaborate, beginning from the very notion of Freud to Lacan and then to Zizek, to understand what these particular notions of the big other and the small other that distinguishes the self and the other divide, which soon seeps into the notion of groups, cliques, races, and religions. Um, this is a point perhaps that I would like to actually make over here, that human beings are basically aggressive, and this sort of an aggression has to be tamed. Otherwise, this shows off in the name of the marking of religion, which actually works as a pretext. And all kinds of religious violences that we see across the world today is, or perhaps is possible to analyze in this psychological manner. That's it.
Thank you, sir. That was very interesting. Thank you for your valuable insights. Now, we would like to move on to the question and answer round. And I would like to address my first question to Professor Xenia Zeiler. Ma'am, Tantric tradition is one of your areas of specialization. The term tantric tradition is by some acknowledged as the practice of violent acts, sacrifices, and eroticism. Can you share your perspective on this?
Yes, certainly, most gladly. Because I would assume that a lot of misconceptions feed into this understanding of Tantra, especially of Tantra as has been a tradition in Sanskrit texts. If you're limiting this to Hindu Tantra now, of course, there's also Buddhist Tantra, which is still yet another matter. So while there are certain texts which indeed give ritual instructions to perform certain very powerful, they are believed to be very powerful rituals, which can result or which are even aimed precisely at resulting in the harming of another person, that I think needs to be clarified on many levels. For one, I need to say that this is indeed a particular strand or school or movement within the much larger tantric traditions or Hindu tantric traditions. It's just one strand which is not dominant in any way. The other thing is that these rituals, these Shatkarman rituals, the harming or magical rituals, which are found in certain texts, as I said, that they always basically are recommended in cases where an individual, that is the person who is looking for these rituals, the practitioner who might want to do such a ritual, only if that individual is in peril, in danger. It's basically self-defense we are talking about in many of these cases. That is yet another level which we have to keep in mind. So it's certainly an entire misconception to understand tantric traditions as strongly promoting violent rituals or anything of that kind. That's just not true. Hindu tantric texts have many faces. In fact, we don't have, of course, any information about whether these very, call them violent or very aiming at harming people, whether these rituals were ever indeed practiced or are practiced today. We just don't know that. So these are some of the misconceptions about Tantra which we should please keep aside.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. That definitely gives us a lot of perspective. And my second question to you is that you have edited a book titled Digital Hinduism, and it also happens to be one of your areas of research. However, digital religion is a relatively new concept. Many ritualistic practices in the Hindu community contain acts of violence like mutilation and animal sacrifice, for example. According to you, is the digital practice of religion a roadblock to the essence of rituals or a healthy practice that can tame the violent aspect of religion?
Yes, there are many questions in one block, which you asked here. Well, yes, digital religion is in a way a new concept or approach, but that has just to do with the fact that digital spaces are a relatively new development, obviously. So the research on digital Hinduism has been done since we have digital spaces. And increasingly scholars try to relate that to the broader subfield of digital religion, which exists by today. When it comes to the violence, what you call, and I would contest that, in fact, what you call violent acts of you said animal sacrifice, I remember mutilation, you also mentioned. And this also relates to something that Professor Bandyopadhyay has mentioned now, I believe, if I understood him correctly. But I would very, very strongly object to placing acts of, in our case, ritual sacrifice of animals anywhere near the violence against people, which in the worst case scenario would be killing of people. I would argue that these are very different matters, and ritual sacrifice of animals, and for that matter, the eating of animals for self-preservation, again, just because people needed food, has been part of the cultural practices of humankind since, we don't know when, but since very, very early, obviously. I can't see that anywhere near, as I said, the violence, religiously or otherwise, kindled violence against human beings. These are different things. Also, when it comes to animal sacrifice, of course, that is, yes, part of the cultural practices also around festivals. We heard the example of Kali Puja from Professor Debashsis, but it is also, I believe, not part of what a majority of Hindu practitioners have been practicing and are practicing today. Your last question was targeted more at this ritual practices as related to violent potential of some kind, I understood. So a violent aspect of religion, I believe you called it. I would also again urge for caution here, because who are we to judge what certain individual practitioners decide to do in a Kali Puja, let's use that example again, festival? If they decide to offer a goat, as has been the tradition of the community or of the family or whatever the background is, why would we feel the need to tame that? The word taming is something which I would object to. We are not in the position to prescribe practices to anyone. We are there to understand why this happens, and how the context of these practices might be. Well, yes, and I tried to give a few suggestions to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. That also gave us a lot of perspective regarding the misconceptions that we have. We will be open to audience questions at the end of the session. I would now like to ask questions to Professor Juergensmeyer. Sir, my first question to you is: in your book, Terror in the Mind of God, The Global Rise of Religious Violence, you have written about how, from biblical wars to acts of martyrdom, violence has always had a presence in religious activities. We have seen that the flag bearers of religion commit violent acts in the name of their God, take the lives of innocent victims, and terrorize entire populations. Can you shed some light on this matter regarding why religion and violence have always been enmeshed?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And in my comments, I'm so happy to be a part of this panel because my perspective is really quite similar to that of Professor Zeiler and Professor Bandyopadhyay. And when Professor Bandyopadhyay was talking about Freud and the psychological dimensions, I'm struck by the fact that one of the founders of I'm a social scientist, I'm not a psychologist, but one of the founders of social science, Emil Durkheim, uh, came to a similar kind of observation in talking about the role of religion in social identity. And he observed the gathering of large crowds. It could be a football, crowd at a football stadium, and we know how violence is often associated with these football crowds. Or it could be a cricket crowd, or a political rally, or the Kumbh Mela with huge numbers of people. And again, we've often seen violence associated with that. But all of these cases, from a Durkheimian perspective, are examples of what he called the effervescence of being a part of a crowd. You're buoyed by, and here a Freudian term, that oceanic spirit, the oceanic feeling of being kind of carried away with something greater than yourself. And that gives a sense of, a false sense really, of empowerment, a sense of power that can be thrilling. It can also be destructive because crowds in such a spirit of effervescence can do horrible things. This is where lynch mobs come in with the old West in the United States, where people be, they would be kind of cheered on and they would be stirred up by the passions. We saw that in the United States on January 6th, where the then president of the United States, Donald Trump, stirred up the crowd with such a kind of frenzy of excitement that they then stormed the Capitol building. Well, this is a kind of act of excitement, of exuberance in a festival setting, kind of a crowd setting that led directly to violence. And it's no surprise that Putin, feeling that his scheme didn't work, that immediately Ukraine did not fall, that his army was floundering, that the morale in Russia was flagging in these recent weeks during the whole sad Ukraine episode, he decided to have a rally, a huge rally in Moscow, and brought everybody together. And a crowd that he claimed was 200,000 was probably less than 80,000, but no matter, it was still a large number. Probably government workers, but that's all right. There was still a large number of people, and he could stand in front and he could kind of be buoyed by the effervescence of this collective identity that crowds give. And so the festivals and religious occasions help feed on that and provide what Durkheim described as a kind of iconic, symbolic expression to collective social identity.
Okay. Thank you, sir. That was very insightful. My second question to you is, can you shed light on the dichotomy of how something as sacred as worshipping of deities and joyous like festivals, which are often identified as symbols of peace and brotherhood, not only inspire an ideology of hatred, but also provide the motivation and paraphernalia to the perpetrators of violent acts?
Sure, because these iconic symbols then provide that identity for good or for evil. And as Professor Bandyopadhyay said, it helps to demarcate the in group from the out group. And and in the best sense, and here religion also plays a very positive role, as Professor Bandyopadhyay said, you can expand that vision. You can expand your sense of selfhood beyond your small social circle, your particular religious identity. And you can do what many of my students do in my courses on global studies and global citizenship. Think of themselves as true citizens of the world in a social arena that encompasses not just one's own religious identity, one's gender identity, one's racial identity, or one's national identity, but ultimately the entire family of humanity. And this becomes more important in an era where we are, as humans, are imperiling the planet through our activities that lead to global warming and activities of violence that threaten nuclear disaster. We as humans need to identify together. But that's the positive part of religion. But often we don't. And often we do narrow our identities, and we affix our religious affiliations to a very certain circle that gives us a sense of who we are as opposed to who they are. And this religious othering, while understandable, a natural part of the human condition, can also often lead to forms of violence. And festivals, parades, activities of this nature are all these forms of collectivity that simply exacerbate and demonstrate the power of collective identity.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing your valuable insights. I would like to now move to Professor Bandyopadhyay. My first question to you is, sir, you have authored a paper on violence in Buddhist folk rituals, exorcism being one of them. However, Buddhism has always been considered a religion that promotes peace and non-violence. Can you please shed some knowledge on this coexistence of peace and violence in these festivities and religious activities?
Yeah. This was a paper that focused actually on the low country of Sri Lanka, where especially the Videha tribes, uh, who actually were the indigenous tribes of Sri Lanka, who even before the Buddhism came to Sri Lanka had been extant there. They were used to different kinds of non-violent ways of worshipping their gods, like the old primordial kinds of religions that worked in different kinds of indigenous tribes. Now, after the Sinhalese, who came from India, one of the Indo-Aryan branches of civilization, came and started colonizing Sri Lanka, and Buddhism was one of the ways in which their religious dictum of conversion spread in Sri Lanka. They have had a lot of difficulty in the form of a resistance coming from these indigenous tribal cults, tribal communities. So in order to allay the kind of violent resistance that were coming from these tribal communities, these Buddhist Sinhalese, what they did was they allowed these particular ritual ways of the tribal communities to exist, so much so that their attention or their particular agenda of violent resistance against the colonizers get diverted to a kind of a ritual violent shock absorber. So they allowed these particular tribal rituals to continue within the converted Buddhist space, so much so that it acted as a shock absorbent against the kind of violence or the decolonizing violence that otherwise they would have actually faced. For example, the kind of indigenous gods that they worshipped were looked upon by the Sinhalese, Buddhist Sinhalese, as yakshas, as the Rakshasas. We know about Ravana being called as a Rakshasa, which we actually don't know whether he is divine or Rakshasa. In fact, there in the Ramayana, there had been a lot of references to Ravana being a blessed child of gods, the same Aryan gods whom the Aryans worshipped, Rakshasa, but Ravana was considered to be the disciple of that sort of a god. But even then, he had been marginalized as a kind of a Rakshasa. So the kind of Yakshasas, Rakshasas, and the Nagas, which were the indigenous groups in Sri Lanka, they practiced these ritual violences, which were accommodated within the Buddhist cult, especially for political reasons or to make the colonization process convenient for them, and that remained extant and continued everlastingly after that. That was the reason why sort of within Buddhist cult, especially tribal Buddhist cults, actually working in terms of different kinds of violent forms of ritualism. It is almost like comparing, say, for example, in southern India, there were a lot of Dalit people, those who are lower caste people, being completely tormented and traumatized by the higher class casteism. Many of them converted into Christianity. In Maharashtra, many of them converted into Buddhism. But then, even in Christianity, Indian Christianity in Kerala, for example, or in Buddhism in Maharashtra, these lower caste people, once being converted, continue to suffer from this marginalization within Christianity, although Christianity doesn't preach casteism at all, or Buddhism does not preach casteism at all. But since it is an Indian scenario, the very notion of the prevalent ideas of casteism gets extirpated and fixed within the Christian and even the Buddhist norms as well. The same thing happened almost in a different way in Sri Lanka.
All right, so that
Yes.
was very informative. Thank you so much. My second question to you is, you have done some extensive research on psychoanalysis. Normally we have observed that human beings are considered to be sinners since birth across several cultures. Hence several practitioners of religious activities resort to violent deeds. Can you tell us about this ideology from a more psychological point of view?
Um, and a little while ago, Mark was speaking about the notion of oceanic drive, the oceanic drive. In fact, that reminds me about the very beginning of Freud's civilization and its discontents, where Freud refers to Romarola. Romarola was at the time when Freud was writing Civilization and its Discontents, and he sent the manuscript. Before that, he wrote another work called The Future of Illusion, and he sent it to Romarola for his comment. Romarola at that point of time was in India, was studying Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. Romarola read this particular term called oceanic being used by Sigmund Freud from a psychoanalytic point of view, and he reported back in a letter to Freud saying that Sigmund, the term oceanic that you were referring to from a psychological point of view, psychoanalytical point of view, is ununderstandable, incomprehensible to me. But what I understand as oceanic is a sort of an epiphanic idea after reading Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. Now, Freud does not join issue with Romarola. He says that what Romarola considers to be oceanic from an epiphanic point of view is nothing in psychology, but simply a sort of a pre-egoic going back to the prenatal state of a pre-egoic condition. That means once the ego in psychoanalysis is developed in the mirror stage from a Lacanian point of view, it creates a sort of a separation between the self and the other. Before that, if you had children at home, you might have seen before the pre-egoic in the pre-egoic state of condition, even if a tiger passes by, a dog passes by, a child in the pre-egoic state will not make a difference between itself and the other. It will try to put its hand in the mouth of a tiger. It will try to bend the tail of a dog because it doesn't know how to make a difference between itself and the other. But in the mirror stage, which I don't have much time to clarify what a mirror stage in Lacanian point of view in the imaginary state of mind is, but let me tell you, once the ego comes working, it makes a sort of a wall between the self and the other. But even if the ego is working within us in an adult state of condition, in an egoic state of condition, the pre-egoic state of condition remains as a remnant, as a sort of a trace, to use the Derridian term, in ourself. That is why, to use a literary term, Coleridge makes a famous observation in his notion of primary imagination, saying that primary imagination is, Mark was speaking about the notion of imagination. Coleridge says that primary imagination is the repetition in the finite mind of the infinite I am. This is exactly what Coleridge is referring to as the pre-egoic state of mind existing within the finite mind, that means within the egoic mind. So Mark was saying that it is possible to broaden this particular egoic state of the narrowness. This is very possible because of the pre-egoic state always already dominant within us, even in our egoic state of condition. So that is the oceanic state of condition that we constantly wish to get back to. But that oceanic state of condition can broaden the egoic self. Egoic self is a plastic self, it is the elastic self. It can continue to broaden the horizon of yourself and continue to encompass the entire universe in a state of fraternity and a bonhomie. It is possible to do that, but at the same time, as Mark had pointed out, in a big football match, for example, you have a lot of people and you consider a great notion of solidarity. It also creates a sense of going back. Oceanic means to get back to the womb. The oceanic state in psychology is the state of the mother's womb. And the child's desire to return back to the mother is a very, 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 very uncivil, quote unquote, uncivil, natural, libidinal desire to annihilate one's own self. So the oceanic condition can be a sort of a paradoxical psychodynamic condition. It can liberate the ego and encompass the entire world to its fold, so much so that you can take the entire world and drown yourself in the ocean, or you can drown yourself in the ocean, or you can resuscitate the entire world from nothing. It can take two different versions according to the terms of normativity. Certainly, if now you have been told love thy neighbor as thyself, then what happens during the time of war? For example, when India was partitioned into two halves in 1947, what happened? Suddenly one day, in one fine night at 12 o'clock, people getting up from sleep to find out that the state had coercively divided us into two. So what was known as the law an hour ago had suddenly turned into an anti-law an hour later. That was state-sponsored coercive notion of a political notion of law creation. So the very notion of normativity changes. So in the case of repressed, we are constantly living in a state of repressed condition. That means any some sort of a symbolic state of condition with a capital S is a repressed state of condition. We cannot satisfy our libidinal desires. We live an unnatural life. But then for the sake of civilization, we have to leave that. So naturally, civilization is causing a state of discontent within us. And this particular discontent in any unnatural, non-normative state of condition can explode. So that is why the state, the religion, all forms of laws are created in order that we have a particular means of restricting these particular dangerous drives. But in cases of no law, in cases of anti-normativity, it might actually give birth to what we actually are. That is what we mean by the notion of violence, especially in terms of rituals and festivals. That, as I told you in my talk, that religion actually can work as a sort of excuse and a pretext for this violent drive for us. You are simply exorcising your libidinal self by the use of religion in such cases. But that does not mean, just to make a point here, that does not mean that religion is useless. Religion can create a very constructive form of livelihood. Religion can actually work as a sort of a channelizer for these libidinal drives towards sublimation, which is what is important. But if religion is politicized and the ego was not allowed to understand how politics works in order to exploit our unconscious, it can be dangerous. That is exactly what all civil people require to be on their guards.
Thank you, sir. That was some valuable information. Now, we would like to take some questions from the audience, and the questions are open to all of you. So, the first question that we have is it possible for one to become compassionate and kind-hearted, even if the situation is akin to Frankenstein? All these are about practices, right? Continuous struggle. How can one learn to channel the drives? So, the question has been addressed to Professor Bandyopadhyay. Um,
Uh, yes, it is possible to become compassionate. That is exactly what we are taught to become. We have a sort of a love for ourselves. We cannot completely gainsay the iota of eros that we actually have, iota for self-love, and we can replicate ourselves in others as well, which is the expansive notion of the ego, as I told you. So in practices, there are different forms of practices which can channelize this particular day drive, this thanatic drive. For example, the very fact that I am talking, that Mark is talking, that Zeiler is talking over here is one way of channelizing our day drives or our libidinal drives into a sort of a constructive way. T.S. Eliot used a famous observation saying that lips that cannot kiss sing. It's a very interesting comment for myself. It says that lips that cannot kiss sing. That means the normal desire of the lips, the normal work of the lips is actually kissing. But since it is an uncivil act in different contexts, we have to become frustrated to some extent, but then channelize our drive for that natural proclivity into a sort of a song, which can be a romantic song for that matter, about kissing or about love. That is a form of channelizing. For example, a doctor who goes to operate his a patient, is actually channelizing his libidinal drives into a professional, into a vocational way of a civil vocation. For example, a runner, an athlete who is running in the field in order to, as a sportsman, for example, is simply channelizing his drive in that matter. The yogis in Hinduism, the saints in Christianity, the saints in Islamism, and all forms of religious saints are simply struggling constantly to sublimate this particular libidinal drive into a state of a civil notion of oceanic state that actually Romarola had pointed out. That is very difficult to do. That is why people continuously strive to get a means of doing that. Once you get into that state of condition, there would be no requirement to get back to that libidinal states of distractions any longer. But that should be the aim of life. That is why religion is so very important. We always have different kinds of secular instruments and at the same time religious instruments at hand to distract your drives.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your valuable inputs. Professor Zeiler, Professor Juergensmeyer, would you like to add something to what Professor Bandyopadhyay just said?
Well, no, I think Professor Bandyopadhyay put it very well, that the religion is not anything by itself. It can be used for good or for evil. And it can be used to channel the highest of one's aspirations as well as the most destructive. It's up to us to decide.
Thank you, sir.
And I would add, it's not only up to us as individuals to decide, but certainly also to our social surroundings. Me as a person who is informed in my research by social constructivism, certainly I would want to point out it's not so much about the individual, it's more about where the individual is placed.
Thank you, ma'am. We would like to take one more question before we end the session. Sir, it is actually addressed to all of you. Is there any relationship between the unconscious desire to oppress the other, the submissive, which lead us to engage in the sacrifice of the animals? Is it also the same for the sacrifice of human children? Ma'am, would any one of you like to take it?
Well, there's a
Yes, Zeiler or Mark?
within the field of the study of religion, there's been a tradition of focusing on sacrifice as the elemental form of religiosity. And the question is why? In Durkheim's reading, it was a matter of giving to the gods and wanting to receive something for gods. It was a matter of exchange. In Freud's reckoning, it was a matter of displaced violence. If you are violent towards an animal, for example, it can diffuse your aggression, so you won't be violent towards other people. It was a symbolic form of violence. But it's also taken in a more literal sense in the case of martyrdom, that is, that one sacrifices oneself. When I was doing interviews with the leaders of the Hamas movement, for example, and I was discussing with them their use of suicide bombing in Israel as a way of empowering their movement, they quickly corrected me and said that these are not suicide bombers. Islam does not approve of suicide. And I said, yes, well, I know that. That's what makes me wonder about this technique. They said, these are not suicide bombers. They're self-martyrs. These are people who have chosen to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the community and for the sake of their faith. So it's a powerful concept that that the giving of life is in some way related to, in Durkheimian sense, as a way of redeeming life, of giving more life. It may be a false equation. It may be used in very perverse ways. Certainly the whole history of socialism, of communism, is based on sacrificing one generation for the sake of the next. And Putin was trying to evoke those images in his speech at his rally in Moscow just this last week. The need for the nation to sacrifice, to rise up in behalf of the greater good. Well, this is fine and good unless it's your son or daughter who's being sacrificed. Then suddenly the whole equation looks a lot different. But the idea is there, and a very powerful one, about how these, what can be seen as metaphors, are symbolic acts, can also be used as powerful tropes in the act of human aggression, and particularly in times of warfare.
Thank you, sir. Professor Zeiler, Professor Bandyopadhyay, would you like to add something to what Professor Juergensmeyer just said? All right, then. With that, we come to an end to tonight's session. Thank you to each one of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure that our live audience that is watching this on Facebook had a wonderful time as well. I thank you all for taking out time from your extremely busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion organized on the TMYS platform. It was an absolute pleasure to have you all this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Pragya. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Xenia.
Thank you.